The wind off Lake Ontario cut through the parking lot like a blade. And Simon Radcliffe pulled his daughter's hood tighter before pushing open the door of the Maple Leaf Diner. "Careful, the step's icy," he said, one hand on Freya's shoulder, the other holding the door against the gust. Freya, 7 years old and missing her left front tooth, hopped over the threshold like it was a game. "Dad, can we get the poutine, the real one, with the squeaky cheese?" "We'll see," Simon said, which was his way of saying yes without committing to it out loud first. He'd learned that trick from his own father, years ago, back when yes felt like a promise you had to keep no matter what. Inside, the diner smelled like burnt coffee and maple syrup, and the windows had fogged up from the heat fighting the cold outside. It was a Tuesday in late January, the kind of evening where Toronto felt smaller than it was. Everyone hurrying somewhere warm. Simon had just come off a 10-hour shift at the auto shop on Danforth. His knuckles still faintly stained with grease, no amount of soap ever fully lifted. His back ached in that dull, permanent way it had for the last 2 years. Ever since his ex-wife left for Calgary with a promise to send for Freya, once things settled. A promise that had quietly stopped being mentioned, somewhere around Freya's 6th birthday. He didn't think about that much anymore, or he tried not to. They slid into a booth by the window, the vinyl seat cold against the backs of their knees. Freya immediately started drawing on the paper placemat with the crayons the waitress dropped off, her tongue poking out the side of her mouth in concentration. "You did good on your spelling test," Simon said, sliding the laminated menu toward her even though she couldn't read most of it yet. "Mrs. Okafor said so." "I know," Freya said without looking up. "I got a sticker. It's a dinosaur." "A dinosaur. Fancy." He smiled, and for a second the ache in his shoulders let go a little. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up into graying hair, came by and took their order. Poutine to share, a hot chocolate for Freya, black coffee for Simon. He did the math in his head as she walked away. He had $40 left until Friday's paycheck, and rent was already spoken for. But Freya deserved a warm dinner that wasn't reheated pasta at the kitchen counter. And honestly, so did he. The food came 15 minutes later, the fries golden and glistening, under a blanket of gravy and cheese curds that squeaked when Freya bit into them, which made her laugh every single time, like it was the first time she'd ever heard it. Simon watched her eat with the kind of quiet satisfaction that had become the main currency of his life. This, her laughing for cheese curds, was worth more to him than almost anything else he could think of. That was when he noticed the woman by the door. She'd been standing there a moment too long, the kind of long that made a person invisible on purpose. She was maybe mid-30s, wearing a coat that had clearly been made for a milder winter than this one. Her boots soaked dark at the toes from slush. Beside her stood a little girl, 5 or 6, bundled in a jacket 2 sizes too big, mittens clipped to the sleeves with plastic clasps. The woman's eyes were fixed on the cash register, doing some private calculation, her lips moving slightly. But the little girl wasn't looking at the register at all. She was looking at Simon's table, at the poutine. Not the way a kid looks at food because it smells good. Simon had seen that look before. He'd seen it on Freya's own face, 2 winters ago, during the 6 weeks after the divorce when his hours got cut and grocery money had to stretch further than it wanted to. It wasn't hunger for a treat. It was hunger, plain and simple, wearing a child's face because it had nowhere else to sit. The woman noticed her daughter's gaze and gently tugged her hand. She bent down and whispered something, and the girl's face fell. But she nodded and let herself be turned toward the door. They were leaving. Quietly, the way people leave when they've already decided they don't belong somewhere. Simon set his fork down. He didn't think it through, not really. His body was already half out of the booth before his mind caught up with what he was doing. "Excuse me," he called out. The woman froze at the sound, her shoulders rising toward her ears like she'd been caught doing something wrong. She turned slowly, and up close Simon could see the exhaustion sitting behind her eyes. The particular kind that doesn't come from one bad night, but from 100 of them stacked in a row. "Sorry," Simon said quickly, raising a hand. "Didn't mean to spook you." "It's fine," she said, though her voice suggested otherwise. "Did you need something?" Simon glanced down at the little girl, who was staring resolutely at her own boots now. "Would she like something to eat? We've got way more than we can finish." The woman's face colored instantly, a flush climbing up from her collar. No, thank you. We're just heading out." As if the universe had decided to argue with her, the little girl's stomach growled, loud enough that a man 2 booths over glanced up from his newspaper. The silence that followed felt enormous in the small diner. The woman closed her eyes for half a second, like she was absorbing a blow. Freya, who had been watching the whole exchange with the unfiltered attention only children manage, slid her own plate a few inches across the table. "She can have some of mine. There's lots." That's really kind," the woman said, her voice catching. "But we can't accept charity, we're okay." Simon understood that. He understood it more than most people would guess, looking at him. A big guy in a Carhartt jacket with grease under his nails. Pride was sometimes the last thing a person had left to hold on to, and he wasn't about to be the one who took it from her. So he didn't argue. He just smiled, easy and unbothered, the way you'd offer a neighbor a ride when your car happened to be going the same direction anyway. "Then it's not charity," he said. "Call it two families splitting a table on a cold night. Happens all the time around here." The woman looked at him for a long moment, like she was trying to find the catch in it and couldn't. Finally, she nodded once and let her daughter lead her to the booth. The waitress brought over extra plates without being asked, the kind of small unspoken understanding that servers in diners like this one seemed to specialize in. The little girl, whose name they'd learn shortly was Iris, ate carefully at first, small polite bites, before hunger overtook manners entirely and she was working through the fries like she hadn't eaten a real meal in days. Which, as it turned out, was close to the truth. The woman's name was Aline. She kept her coat on even inside, arms tucked close, and it took her most of the meal before she said much beyond thank you. "I'm sorry," she finally admitted, watching Iris eat. "We haven't had a proper dinner since Sunday." Something in Simon's chest tightened. "You don't have to apologize for that," he said. "Nobody should be sorry for being hungry." Over the next 20 minutes, in fragments the story came out. Aline had worked at a call center out in Scarborough until the company folded without warning back in November. The kind of corporate collapse that made headlines for a day. And then vanished, leaving people like her scrambling in the wreckage nobody covered. She'd fallen behind on rent trying to keep Iris in her daycare. Then fallen behind further paying for a specialist when Iris had a bad bout of pneumonia over Christmas. By New Year's the landlord had changed the locks. Since then, they'd been staying in Aline's 10-year-old Corolla, parked in different lots around the East End. Depending on which ones the bylaw officers checked less often. She'd tried the shelters, but the family ones had wait lists longer than she had patience left to survive, and she wasn't willing to be separated from Iris to get a bed faster somewhere else. "People think it doesn't happen here," Aline said quietly, looking down at her hands. "Not in a city like this. Not to people who had jobs, apartments, all of it." Simon didn't say anything for a moment. He was thinking about the 18 months after his own divorce, the ones nobody outside his apartment building had known about. The nights he'd eaten cereal for dinner, so Freya could have the last of the good groceries. The calls to his sister he never made, because he didn't know how to ask for help without it sounding like failure. "It happens to more people than you'd think," he said finally. "Most of them just get good at hiding it." Freya and Iris, meanwhile, had become fast friends in the particular high-speed way small children do, trading ketchup packets and comparing loose teeth. Freya proudly showing off the gap where hers had come out the week before. For a few minutes, watching them, Aline's face lost some of its rigid carefulness. A real smile broke through, brief but unmistakable. The kind of smile Simon guessed she hadn't allowed herself in a while, like she'd been rationing it along with everything else. By the time the plates were cleared, the wind outside had picked up into something closer to a proper storm. Sleet ticking hard against the windows. Aline thanked him 3 separate times as they gathered their things. Already pulling her coat tighter for the walk back to wherever the car was parked. Simon watched through the fogged glass as she took Iris's hand and stepped out into the weather, and something about the sight of them, small, hunched, heading toward a 15-year-old sedan in a snowstorm, sat wrong in his stomach in a way he couldn't ignore. He glanced at Freya. She was already watching him, the way kids do when they've picked up on something before the adults finish deciding it. "Dad," she said, "they can't sleep in a car. It's freezing." Simon closed his eyes for a second. He thought about his one-bedroom apartment on Coxwell, the pull-out couch that had come with the place. The fact that his bank account had exactly enough in it to get them through to Friday and not a dollar further. He thought about how easy it would be to just wave, wish her luck, and go home to his own warm bed with a clean conscience, because he'd already done something. He'd bought her dinner, hadn't he? That was more than most people would have done. But then he thought about the winter after the divorce, and the neighbor 2 doors down, a retired schoolteacher named nobody he even remembered clearly anymore, who'd started leaving casseroles outside his door, without ever making it a whole conversation, without ever making him feel small for needing it. He'd never gotten the chance to properly thank her before she passed. Maybe this was how you did that kind of debt. Not by paying the person back, but by paying it forward to whoever needed it next. He grabbed his jacket off the hook and pushed out into the storm before he could talk himself out of it. "Aline," he called, jogging to catch up. She turned, startled, one arm curled protectively around Iris's shoulders. "This is going to sound strange," Simon said, breathing hard in the cold, "but I've got a pull-out couch. It's not much. But it's warm, and it's got a door that locks, and you two shouldn't be out here tonight." Aline stared at him. "We can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering." He shrugged, trying to keep it light, like it wasn't the biggest thing he'd said to a stranger in years. "We'll figure the rest out tomorrow. Tonight just come in out of the cold." Her eyes filled, and this time it wasn't only exhaustion behind them. Iris peeked out from under her mother's arm, snowflakes catching in her eyelashes, and looked up at Simon like he'd just told her something impossible was true. Freya cheered from the diner doorway, jumping in place with her hood bouncing, entirely unaware of how enormous the moment actually was. The way kids are blessedly unaware of the size of things. And there, under the flickering streetlight with the storm hammering down around them, 4 strangers who'd walked into a diner separately somehow found themselves standing together, like something closer to family. The apartment on Coxwell wasn't much to look at. 1 bedroom, a kitchen the size of a closet, a bathroom with a tile floor that was always slightly too cold no matter the season. But it was warm, and it was dry, and when Simon unfolded the pull-out couch and pulled clean sheets from the hall closet, Aline sat down on the edge of it like she wasn't quite sure it was real. "You don't have to do this," she said again, for what felt like the 10th time that evening. "I know," Simon said. "That's kind of the point." Freya insisted Iris sleep in her room instead. On a nest of blankets and stuffed animals, she arranged with the seriousness of an architect. And by the time Simon checked in on them, 20 minutes later, both girls were fast asleep. Iris curled up with Freya's old stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. In the kitchen, Aline sat at the small table, with a cup of tea Simon had made her, her hands wrapped around it like she was trying to memorize the warmth. "I keep waiting for the part where this goes wrong," she admitted quietly. "People don't just do this. Not for strangers. Maybe they should more," Simon said, leaning against the counter. "I had a rough couple years myself after my ex left. Nobody swooped in and fixed everything. But there were a few people who did small things. A meal here, a ride there, one guy from my building who covered half my hydro bill 1 month and never once brought it up again. It adds up. It's the only reason I'm standing here able to do the same for somebody else." Aline was quiet for a moment. "I had a job interview lined up for Thursday," she said finally. "Front desk at a medical clinic out in the East End. I've been trying to figure out how I was even going to show up looking presentable. Coming from the car. You'll show up from here," Simon said. "Shower, ironed shirt, the whole thing. We'll sort it." She looked at him like she was trying to figure out what he wanted in return. The way people do when kindness with no strings attached feels almost more suspicious than cruelty. Simon understood the instinct. He didn't take it personally. "I'm not going to pretend I've got it all figured out," he said. "I'm 1 bad month away from struggling myself most of the time. But I've got a couch tonight and you needed one. That's the whole equation." The interview on Thursday went well. Better than well, actually. The clinic manager, a brisk, kind-eyed woman named Odette, called Aline back that same afternoon to offer her the position, front desk and light admin work, starting the following Monday. It wasn't a fortune, but it was steady, and steady was worth more than gold to someone who'd been living without it. What Simon hadn't expected was how naturally the arrangement kept extending itself. A night became 3 nights, became a week, became an understanding nobody had explicitly agreed to, but that both adults seemed to accept. This was working, for now, and neither of them was in a hurry to disturb it. Freya and Iris settled into a rhythm that made the small apartment feel less cramped and more full. Mornings spent fighting over the last waffle. Evenings spent building elaborate blanket forts in the living room that Simon had to carefully step around after both girls went to bed. Aline started contributing what she could toward groceries the moment her first paycheck came through, refusing to let the arrangement tip fully into charity, even as it clearly wasn't anymore. It was mid-February, nearly 3 weeks in, when Aline came home from work with something folded carefully in her coat pocket. A pamphlet from a transitional housing program the clinic's social worker had told her about. One specifically for single parents rebuilding after a housing loss. There was a wait list, of course, there always was, but her caseworker thought her chances were good given her steady employment and, notably, her current stable housing situation. "They asked where we were staying," Aline said, setting the pamphlet on the kitchen table. "I told them the truth. That a man I met at a diner took us in when we had nowhere else to go." Simon read the pamphlet twice, feeling something loosen in his chest that he hadn't fully realized was still tight. That's good news. That's really good news. It's because of you, Aline said. None of this happens if you don't come after us into a snowstorm like a lunatic. I prefer a good Samaritan with questionable timing, Simon said, and she laughed. A real laugh this time, unguarded, the kind that made the whole kitchen feel warmer. The approval came through 6 weeks later, faster than either of them expected. A one-bedroom unit in a building not 10 minutes from Simon's. Subsidized enough that it fit comfortably within what Aline was earning at the clinic, with a program worker checking in monthly to help her stay on track. The morning they moved the last of Aline and Iris's things, which amounted to 2 duffel bags and a box of kitchen things Aline had slowly reassembled. Freya cried in the doorway, refusing to say goodbye properly until Iris promised, with the full solemnity a 6-year-old could muster, that they'd still see each other every weekend. They kept that promise. Saturdays became a fixed point on both families' calendars. Sometimes at the diner where it had all started. Sometimes at the little park near Aline's new building. Sometimes just at Simon's apartment with all 4 of them, crowded around the small table playing card games. Until it got embarrassingly late for a school night. By the time spring came properly to the city, the ice off the lake finally breaking, and the maple trees along the Coxwell Strip budding out in that stubborn, hopeful way Canadian trees do after a hard winter, Aline had been promoted to office coordinator at the clinic, with a raise substantial enough that she'd started, quietly and without telling anyone, putting a little aside each month into an account she wouldn't touch except for one purpose. She told Simon about it on a Saturday in May, the 2 of them sitting on a park bench, watching Freya and Iris chase each other around a jungle gym, sunlight finally warm enough to sit outside without a coat. There's a woman at the clinic, Aline said. Patient, not staff. She comes in every couple weeks with her son. I heard her on the phone once, in the waiting room, trying to negotiate a payment plan for a prescription she couldn't afford. She didn't know I could hear her. Simon looked over at her. I paid it, Aline said, simply. Told the pharmacy to just put it on my card, anonymous. Don't tell her who. It wasn't much. But I remembered exactly what that kind of desperate arithmetic feels like. Doing the math in your head in front of a stranger. Praying the numbers work out different than they actually do. You didn't have to do that, Simon said, though he was smiling. I know, Aline said. That's kind of the point. He recognized his own words coming back to him and laughed, low and surprised, shaking his head. Out on the jungle gym, Iris shrieked with delight as Freya chased her around the slide, both of them entirely oblivious to the quiet, enormous thing that had just passed between the 2 adults on the bench, the exact shape of kindness finding its way forward again, from one person to the next, the way it tends to when somebody, somewhere, decides not to look away. Nobody who watched Simon Radcliffe walk into that diner on an ordinary Tuesday in January could have guessed how far the ripple would travel. Not Simon himself, certainly, who'd only meant to buy a stranger's daughter a plate of fries. But that's usually how it goes. The biggest changes in a life rarely announce themselves. They just sit quietly at the next table, waiting to see if anyone will notice.